I think what I really learned in all of this was to be true to myself, to be true to my inner voice. And I began to see that we really do have a power. Our own lives really do make a difference. Just by being more conscious of the food that we eat, we can heal ourselves, we can heal the environment, we can heal this planet.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Robbins.
When I was younger, I think my family was quite disappointed in me. My father had built a very successful business, Baskin Robbins, and he had groomed me to follow in his footsteps. But as I began to mature, my own conscience pulled me in a different direction. My father had accomplished the American dream. Yet I felt drawn to a deeper dream, a dream of a society at peace with its conscience, because it lived with respect for life, with reverence for life. And soon enough, I left. And I walked away from the ice cream cone-shaped swimming pool in our backyard. And the whole lifestyle, and I told my family I did not want a trust fund, and I didn't want any access or reliance on the family fortune. I really wanted to follow my integrity, follow the call of my conscience, and just see what that would do. I had no idea, but being young and reckless and a little flippant, I felt like giving it a shot. And so I left the family's empire and moved to a little island off the coast of British Columbia with my wife, and we cleared land and we built a log cabin. We began to grow all of our own food. And we began to weave ourselves back into the web of life and trying to dig our roots down into the earth community and feel what that would be like. And lived on about $600 a year for about 7 years. And it was a real pendulum swing, I'm sure you can tell. And my father and family, I mean, I can really understand his point, thinking I was crazy. He had worked so hard to attain a success and had done so, and here I was walking away from it. He couldn't understand. I didn't understand him real well either, I must admit. I was sick physically. I'd had a form of polio as a child that had left me for a time paralyzed from the waist down. I'd had some fairly substantial health problems when I was growing up, and this led me to be very, very interested in how I could regain my health. I explored and experimented with different diets, and I began to look at what most of us eat in this culture, and I began to wonder what impact that has on our health. Heart attacks, certain cancers, osteoporosis, diabetes. The major diseases of our society may be caused in part by what we eat. One of the physicians who helped me to understand why is Dr. Michael Clapper.
I first woke up, so to speak, when I was working on the anesthesia service, learning how to put people to sleep. And I was seeing my patients for the next day's surgery for coronary artery bypass surgery in order to bypass clogged arteries in their heart. Because it was late at night, I drew the man's blood test, and when I took the blood to the laboratory and had it processed, I couldn't believe my eyes. Now, normally, this liquid layer floating on top of the blood clot is quite transparent. It's a yellow, but quite clear. You can see right through it. The blood in this patient's tube, however, was anything but clear. The serum floating on his clot was thick and greasy white. It looked like glue. In fact, it stuck to the sides of the blood tube when I shook the tube. I went back to the patient. I said, "Mr. Phillips, did you eat before you came to the hospital tonight?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What did you have?" He said, "I had a cheeseburger and a milkshake." And when he said that, I realized that what I was looking at in his tube was all the fat in the beef burger, all the butter fat in the cheese, and the butter fat in the ice cream and in the milkshake. And all this fat had oozed out into his blood and actually turned his blood fatty. Well, 30, 40, 50 years of keeping your blood very fatty creates changes in the blood vessels that are very dangerous.
Over the years, arteries can become clogged with fatty material. Then a blood clot can form, blocking the blood flow completely. If the artery leads to the heart, the lack of oxygen can cause heart muscle to die. That's a heart attack. If the clogged artery leads to the brain, the patient has a stroke.
The next morning, we took Mr. Phillips to the operating room, and I put him to sleep, and the surgeon opened up his chest. And from these arteries, he began pulling out yellow, greasy deposits of fatty material called atherosclerosis.
You know, if you were to die of a heart attack, and it's the most common cause of death in the country today, you might have an autopsy performed. It's a fairly common procedure. It used to be more common, but it's still done many, many times. What would happen is your body would be laid out on the autopsy table, and they would cut open your chest and dig around in there and find the coronary artery, the artery feeding the heart, that had gotten plugged up, depriving the heart of its flow of oxygen and blood, killing it, killing you. And they'd find that artery and they'd ream it out. They'd literally pull out a thick sausage-shaped piece of fatty, waxy material that killed you. And they send it very carefully down to the pathology lab. Next day, the results come back, and they always say the same thing. This has been done approximately 3 million times in medical research in the world. And the results always say the same thing. They say, in effect, saturated fat and cholesterol. Now, never once have they come back and said broccoli and tofu.
When I saw all the fat in that patient's blood, I began to think about my own blood. I had done most of my growing up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, and I was eating large amounts of meats and cheese, and I realized that I, too, had a risk rate of 50% for clogging up my arteries and causing a heart attack or stroke.
A high-fat diet is also among the factors suspected in certain types of cancer. Dr. John McDougall.
Well, the first clue that we got on breast cancer and diet was when people looked around the world and they found in different countries they had different rates of breast cancer. For example, in Japan, the risk of breast cancer among their women is very low, whereas in the United States it's many, many times higher, in fact, about 6 times as high.
In countries where people eat less fat, the rates for breast cancer are low. The more fat people eat, the higher the rate for breast cancer. That could be a coincidence, or it could be a clue. One of the most comprehensive studies in world medical history on diet and disease is being conducted in China under the direction of Dr. Colin Campbell of Cornell University.
The study is, in fact, quite unique when compared to other studies in the past, in the sense that we measured so many different kinds of things. As I mentioned, we measured 367 items of information that are subsequently being published that were data that we're happy with. And so in that sense, it's perhaps one of the largest studies that has ever been conducted on the causes of disease. And so it was an ideal opportunity to go to China to have a look at what people are doing in these different regions that are so unique to cause them to get cancers in some places and not in others. And so this survey, which was, of course, very large, it included a total of 100 adults in each of the 65 counties, or a total of 6,500 people.
T. Colin Campbell did a very important study that really captured everybody's attention. He studied the people in China and correlated their diet with their chance of getting various diseases, including breast cancer. And he found that when you ate a very low-fat diet, you know, lots of rice and vegetables and very little oil and very little meat, that you had a very low incidence of breast cancer.
For the individual cancers, in China, breast cancer is much lower, colon cancer is much lower. In our country, they comprise, along with lung cancer, the 3 chief cancers.
To discover the reasons for low cancer rates, Dr. Campbell's researchers collected hundreds of items of information from each person. Heredity, medical history, diet and exercise. The evidence seems to point to one factor.
Well, in China, the animal food consumption is about 10% of the total protein intake, compared in this country to 70% on average. We really consume an extraordinary amount of animal foods in this country compared to China.
The current way in which most Americans eat has never been seen before in human history. Never before have we eaten so much fat and protein on any given day. People have bacon and eggs for breakfast and cheeseburgers for lunch and pizzas for dinner, and they're eating tremendous amounts of fat and protein.
And the message is very clear. If you want to reduce your risk of cancer, you eat less meat, less dairy, less fat in general, including vegetable fats, and you eat more whole grains, fruits, and vegetables.
One theory suggests how a diet high in fat could contribute to certain cancers. Eating more fat appears to create higher levels of the female hormone estrogen in the bloodstream. Estrogen promotes the growth of breast and uterus tissue, and this may set the stage for cancer. In men, eating more fat may produce higher levels of the male hormone testosterone, possibly setting the stage for cancer of the prostate gland.
I think this new information, at least from my perspective, suggests that what we really ought to be doing is consuming less of all animal foods and trying to make up as much of our diet in form of plant foods as possible.
No one has to become vegetarian to reduce their risk of cancer, but every time one substitutes spaghetti for steak, they're taking a major step towards reducing the possibility of developing that disease.
I wanted to learn everything I could, so I started researching and going to medical libraries. I was amazed by what I learned. Osteoporosis is a disease that worries a great many women today. In later years, the bones can become thin and fragile, and they can break quite easily.
You know, the bones look very thin here.
When I was told that I had osteoporosis, I became very frightened because I'm still young. And I literally just fell apart. I remember going to bed and crying, and my husband came in and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I'm disintegrating."
Osteoporosis is a loss of bone tissue. And as a result, when somebody gets osteoporosis, they've essentially lost 50 to 75% of their bone tissue before they get a fracture. And then what happens is they cough or sneeze and they break a rib, or they ride over a bumpy road and they break a backbone. When you look around the world and you see where osteoporosis is common and rare, you're struck by the fact that it's common where people seem to eat the best. In the sense when you consume lots of dairy products, like in countries such as the United States, England, Finland, Sweden, you have the highest rates of osteoporosis. Where they consume the least dairy products, like in your Asian and African countries, they have the strongest bones, the least osteoporosis.
Again, that could be a coincidence, but some don't think it is.
And one of the characteristics in osteoporosis that I think, at least, is rather important, has to do with the intake of animal protein. Animal protein, for example, has been shown to increase the loss of calcium from the body, which, of course, puts a person at a greater risk.
Dairy products contain calcium, which helps to build strong bones. But they also contain concentrated protein, and some suspect that depletes the body of calcium. Dr. Clapper explained the theory.
When one eats a piece of concentrated protein, for the next 3 or 4 hours, more calcium than usual can be lost out of the body through the urine. And when the body loses this mineral, it replaces it by drawing calcium out of the bones. So a high-protein diet, along with smoking and lack of exercise and other factors, may contribute to bones that are thin and fracture easily.
Osteoporosis tends to be a disease characteristic of Western countries, which is really quite interesting because it turns out that in this country, if we listen to the traditional information, it is suggested that the higher the calcium intake, the lower the risk for osteoporosis in women. And so women are being advised to take more calcium. But it's rather strange that in China, where calcium intake is so much lower than here, they actually have lower osteoporosis, not higher.
There are 4 groups that foods are put in. The first one are the dairy products. We have things like...
I remember in school learning about the 4 basic food groups and believing every word of it. I assumed it was the product of the wisdom of our culture.
How many of you had anything from the dairy products today?
Just look at the fine print sometimes on the kind of materials that have been used in the past in our schools. And you'll see, of course, that much of this information is provided by the industry itself. And, of course, they stand to gain.
Ice cream, cheese, and yogurt. Tony.
I wanted to hear what the dairy industry would say.
The Dairy Council is a nutrition, education, and research arm of the dairy industry. It was the National Dairy Council came into being in 1917, so the dairy industry has had a long history of interest in nutrition research and nutrition education, and I might say long before it became the consumer topic that it is today.
The basic 4 food groups, which hangs on the school walls, is an advertisement from industry. I mean, after all, just flip over the back and see who presented it to the classroom. The National Dairy Council or some other industry that's trying to sell their products. It's an advertisement.
The Dairy Council isn't in the business of sales per se. It's in the business of education and research. And if it sells anything with quotes around it, I would say it sells good nutrition, and that's what it's always sold.
You know, people believe in the basic 4 food group because that's what we've been taught ever since we were little kids. But look at the consequences of that kind of belief. We have a country, very modernized country, high-tech country, where disease is the norm. I mean, half the people die of heart disease. 1 out of 10 women gets breast cancer. Obesity is an epidemic. That's the consequence of believing in the basic 4 food group.
What do the 4 food groups really communicate to children? People have different opinions.
If you have 4 basic food groups and 2 of them are meats and dairy products, we're saying to our children that half your food choices should be animal products.
What about this? Which food group? Noah?
The Dairy Council and many schools follow well-established guidelines. But some believe that new findings now justify a change.
Well, the Dairy Council itself has never set public health guidelines, and we see our role really as helping to interpret the guidelines that are out there. And the guidelines today, as most people know, are 30% of calories from fat. And it is possible, and because we do interpret how to do that every day, it's possible to eat a variety of foods, some higher in fat and trading off for some lower in fat to get to that 30%.
I'm suggesting that really it ought to be much lower than that. That the evidence from the scientific literature, not just what we have, but more so from the other scientific literature, suggests that getting down around 15 to 20% of calories, or maybe even lower, is advantageous. And the only way that one can get down that low is not to just consume low-fat products, is what we tend to say now, but more to actually begin to cut out animal foods. In the future, that's the kind of information that we're going to hear more about.
What should we be teaching our children? What sort of diet does promote health?
Around the world, when people are trim and healthy, they suffer from various diseases that we don't have. For example, they have malaria and cholera and so on, but they don't suffer from the heart disease and the breast cancer and the obesity that we have. And the reason is very simple. They center their diet around starch. Absolutely essential that people understand this. This is not a diet of salads and broccoli and cauliflower that we're talking about. We're talking about a diet of rice and potatoes and other types of grains and vegetables, starchy vegetables, with the addition of fruits and vegetables on the side. And that's what people eat in rural Africa and in China and Japan until they become rich.
In China, Dr. Campbell compared regions that are relatively poor to areas which are a good deal more affluent. You might expect the people with a higher standard of living to have better health. Instead, they have more of certain cancers, heart disease, and diabetes. Some believe the crucial difference is this: affluent people eat more animal products.
Animal foods have certain characteristics that would argue raises the risk for some of these diseases. In contrast, plant foods contain factors that actually prevent these diseases from occurring.
A language that you can't forget and deny. This is 5 pounds of fat. This is what 5 pounds of fat weighs, and this is what 5 pounds of fat looks like. And in a few months, many of you may have 6 or 8 of these that you're leaving behind permanently, because you're not doing anything strange. You're just enjoying a lot of healthy, delicious foods.
When patients suffering from heart disease, diabetes, and cancer come to Dr. John McDougall, he gives them a very different prescription. He teaches them a new way to eat.
There are some very simple concepts in nutrition. And one very important one is the idea that cholesterol is only present in animal products. There's absolutely no cholesterol at all in any vegetable product. So that gives you a good idea on how to divide your food choices. Animal products are rich foods and should be reserved for special occasions, and vegetable products should be your daily fare.
Dr. McDougall's patients ask the same questions that I did. If I eat less meat, will I get enough protein?
A very common myth is you can't get enough protein from vegetable foods. That's entirely untrue. And you know, if you look back at the scientific studies done over the last 50 years, they clearly show that for human needs, vegetable proteins are superior. As a matter of fact, I'd challenge any dietitian to try and design me a diet that was protein deficient based around any starch and any vegetables. You can't do it.
How much protein do we need each day? About 50 grams is the amount recommended by the U.S. government. But the average person in this country eats 200% of that amount.
I think that as far as protein intake in the United States is concerned, we're simply consuming too much, particularly too much animal protein, and we really need to seriously take into consideration the possibility of cutting down on the intake of this nutrient.
You know, in our society, people believe that diseases are due to deficiencies. I mean, after all, look at what people are doing. They're, worried about getting enough protein. They're taking handfuls of vitamin pills and mineral pills. I mean, think about it for a minute. How many people do you know who have deficiency diseases? Scurvy, beriberi, pellagra? Any of your friends go to the doctor for a protein deficiency this year? That's not where the problem is. The problem isn't here in terms of deficiency. The problem is over here in terms of excess. Anybody have any friends with problems of excess, like excess calories, excess fat, excess cholesterol? This is where the problem is, not over here. Until you start looking in this direction, you won't have the answer to America's health problems.
Because he believes that food is so fundamental to his patients' health, Dr. McDougall takes the time to teach them new ways to cook. I asked the patients what it was like to change their diet.
My diet before, if you heard me tell you what my daily diet was, you would just sit there and go, oh my God, it was mostly fat.
Usually my habit was I'd have bacon and eggs in the morning, okay? And while I'm finishing them off, I'm wondering what I'm going to have for lunch. And while I'm eating lunch, I say, I wonder what we're going to have for supper. We're going to have that big steak and all that. And I couldn't understand why. It was always gloggy.
Constantly seeing the doctors and having them tell me that I wasn't responding and there was not much hope for my condition.
My patients come to the clinic sick because they've been feasting 21 times a week. As a result, they have diseases of kings and queens. When you stop the cause of an illness, then they have a chance to recover.
I lost 36 pounds. My cholesterol went down to 152.
I feel like $1,000,000, and I feel that there's nothing today that I cannot do.
I feel great. And the reason I'm saying that is because all of those symptoms went away.
Well, I've lost weight, which is great. And, I used to be a chronic dieter with diet pills and all kinds of the latest, the diet thing to do. And now I can eat just like I've always wanted to eat all my life.
And when they learn this very simple message, that you get some exercise, you get proper rest, and you eat the right kinds of foods.
I'm just living, Eddie. That's all I can tell you. It can't be any nicer than that. I'm not going to die, period.
You feel tightness and heaviness? Pains going down your arm?
Several years ago, Carl Parise suffered a heart attack.
I'll be honest with you, at that point, I just figured I'd die on the operating table.
It happens in our country every 32 seconds. The great irony is that in the so-called poor countries, the major diseases that kill us are relatively rare. And people in developing countries are beginning to worry that they could become too much like us.
There is a growing concern that more and more people in the third world are going to the McDonald's chain. Because if we look at the diet of young people in my country today, young children, teenagers, they are beginning to eat more hamburgers as a meal, eating a lot more meat. Eating Western-style meals is becoming very popular among the people who can afford it. And this means that eventually the meat, which was a garnishing or a small part of a big meal, becomes the main course. The same size piece of meat on a plate for one person here would be really cut up into a meal for 5 people at home.
Our agriculture today has to produce twice as much meat per person as it did in 1900. As I traveled across the country, I thought about everything I'd learned. And I realized I wanted to know more about what we eat. I wanted to look behind the scenes at how our food is produced.
For most of the year, they graze on the hillside.
I realized that my pictures of farm animals had come from childhood.
This is a dairy cow and her young calf.
Those peaceful pictures of contented cows.
They need to eat plenty of rich grass.
In real life, I learned there is a strong bond between a newborn calf and its mother. Other cows always seem to show a strong interest in the new calf.
But it's a good, healthy baby bull.
Dairyman John Schoneveld was proud to show me the newest addition to his herd.
Unfortunately, it's a bull. If it was a heifer, I would keep it.
Will he be allowed to nurse, or will he be?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, he will be allowed to nurse. He will stay with his mother tonight, and then tomorrow morning he will be picked up by a broker, which takes him to a place where they raise him.
Are they raised, some of them for veal? Some of
Yes,
them
some are raised for veal.
If a calf born at a dairy is a male, he will often be taken from his mother within a day. Some will be chained at the neck and will live in a cramped space for the remainder of their short lives.
It is the ultimate. There is none finer. It's tender, delicious, succulent. You can almost cut it with your fork. Here is an incredibly popular dish in the finer restaurants. It's called ossobuco. It's the veal shank. They raise the animal in a very special way so that you can have this incredible delicacy.
If an animal is seldom allowed to move, its muscles remain weak and soft.
The muscles of the animal are tender, very pasty. Notice the pale white color, the milky fat.
We pay extra for it. We pay a premium price for it because we're taught to believe that lighter meats are healthier. Pigs have always been a favorite animal of mine. They're playful, sensitive, and affectionate. They have a close family life, and in some ways they're actually more intelligent than dogs. I used to think that pigs were still raised like this, outdoors, in a pleasant barnyard. But this farm, photographed 40 years ago, is a historical relic. Hogs are raised very differently now. To be competitive, farmers have to crowd the maximum number of animals into the smallest possible space. And there they live their whole lives. Pigs have strong natural instincts, rooting, nest building, caring for their young. But in confinement, these strong drives are blocked. And as a concerned citizen, someone who wants my life to be a statement of compassion in some respect for the world, when I see what's done to the animals, it makes me look at my food choices in a whole new way. I have to question, is this what I want my contribution to the world to involve? Today's chickens aren't in barnyards anymore. They aren't scratching around on the earth and pecking away and looking up at the sun and doing the things that chickens have done for millions of years. The layer hens are kept crammed into these cages so tightly they can't even lift a wing. These are birds that have a strong territorial impulse. And so they have a pecking order normally, which they create by spatially orienting themselves. But they can't do that because they're crammed together so tightly. So the result is their instinct causes them to peck at each other constantly. Now, the industry responds to this by cutting off parts of their beaks. It's called debeaking. It's standard operating procedure in the industry today. And the only result of that is they continue to peck, but they can't kill each other in the process.
The poultry industry is a good example where we may have a building that has 100 or 200,000 chickens that are very closely put together. Now, the people who raise the chickens are basically economic creatures. They are responding to the market demand for cheap chicken. And I think that traditionally the humane aspects really didn't even enter the equation. I think the idea was to produce chicken cheaply.
Now, one of the other ways that the industry responds to the overcrowding and the stress and the birds' reactions to it is by feeding them antibiotics.
Well, in a chicken house where you have 200,000 birds, an outbreak of a disease can kill all the birds in a very short period of time. Therefore, you need biosecurity. You need to make sure that the animals have antibiotics to fend off even the smallest infection.
The antibiotics that are fed to livestock are very potent drugs, and residues of these substances are frequently found in meats and dairy products. No one is certain as to the effect that these drugs have in the human body, but it's a very worrisome thing to consider when you sit down and have your lunch.
There's an acceptable level that's set by the federal government, and I assume that this is all right. The problem is you have some people who are irresponsible, and they use the drugs indiscriminately, many times not under veterinary supervision, and then we find huge residue levels.
And if the chickens have been poisoned and if the chickens have been treated so obscenely, then what is it that we're doing to ourselves in the process? And every time I returned home, I tried to understand the meaning of what I was learning. And I found myself remembering Chief Seattle.
About 100 years ago, he was the chief of a northwestern Indian tribe, Native American tribe. At the time when his people had to leave their lands and go to a reservation, very sad. I'm sure you know the story, you know, of how the white men moved across the continent and what occurred. Very tragic. And this was a poignant and pathetic time. And he made a speech. And he said something remarkable that always lived in me. And he said, all right, we'll go. I mean, they had tried everything else. They'd fought, they had run away, they had done everything, but they had to, it was die or go to the reservation. So he said, okay, we'll go. But, he said, I ask one thing in return from the great chief in Washington. That's how he put it. Now, what do you think he asked for? What would you have asked for? When I put myself in his shoes, I think maybe I would have asked for additional horses or blankets or food for the journey. No, he asked something very different. He said, what we really want, the one thing we ask, is that the white man treat the animals of this land as his brothers, as part of his family. Now, why did he ask that? I think I know. And I think he looked at us, he looked at the white man, and he saw our profound alienation, our separation from life, how disassociated we'd become. He saw the war taking place in our lives against nature, against the environment, against each other, against his people, against ourselves. Endlessly, repetitively, dangerously, disastrously. And he wanted to heal us.
I think because for Chief Seattle and his people, to some extent anyway, life itself was sacred. And the sound of the birds singing in the trees were like a choir, and the forests were the cathedrals. And breathing was an act of prayer. We are so interconnected that what we do to the environment and to the other life forms that live in it becomes our own fate. I remember how shocked I was the first time I saw a feedlot. It was a vivid experience of how the food that we choose profoundly affects the environment. When we think of cattle, most of us picture John Wayne and the open range where the cattle eat grass. As early as 6 or 8 months of age, thousands of cattle are brought together to be confined and fattened. A feedlot is an assembly line for producing meat. Feeding grains instead of grass produces meat with the fat and the marbling that Americans have come to prefer. The modern feedlot often produces something else.
The total livestock population in the United States outweighs the human population by 4 times. And they produce an enormous amount of manure, 1.6 billion tons. This is the equivalent of about 6,000 pounds of manure per person in the United States coming directly from livestock.
One of the things that's happened is that the waste that results from a feedlot, for example, of say 20,000 animals, can end up being as much waste as the whole city of Albuquerque. Unfortunately, the cattle don't pay for sewer hookups. So what happens is the waste goes into the ground or into the groundwater or into the surface streams, waste that can be destructive and harmful.
I remembered the dairy that I visited earlier, where I saw the newborn calf.
When they're born, you want to make sure that you get their mouth and their...
John Schoeneveld told me that he's worried about the huge mountains of cow manure piling up all around him.
I'm worried about stockpiles of fertilizer in this valley, because when the wind blows, the fertilizer also blows. And we are very sensitive about our sanitation and keeping a clean product. All of our cows are washed daily, every time they're milked. From the wash pen, we get a lot of washed manure. That's the water that runs off of the animal after the manure has been washed off of her. It's a major problem because the water has to saturate down into the ground. And there's a fear that we are putting those nitrates down to the drinking water level.
When a dairy is surrounded by farms, the manure may be useful to neighbors. But when cities grow up all around, the manure can become a menace.
The Water Quality Control Board came out and tested our water, and they said it was contaminated with nitrates. And we were like really shocked. And then we started wondering about the health effects for our children.
Carol Close and her family live near another dairy in Southern California. She wonders whether her child's birth defects could have been caused by nitrates in the water. Research suggests that nitrates may be the cause of serious medical problems.
Nitrates in the drinking water can be a serious threat. Little babies drinking water contaminated with nitrates can actually turn blue because the nitrate combines with the hemoglobin in their blood that carries oxygen, and the babies are unable to get oxygen to their tissues. And the so-called blue baby syndrome can be damaging or even lethal for a small infant.
And it turns out that nitrates could be passed through in breast milk.
What I saw was a situation in which everyone was frustrated.
I wondered about if my children had experienced any loss of oxygen to their brain that could hurt their development, their mental development. I worried about problems that might come up in the future. I worried about my neighbors who were still drinking the water after they found out it was contaminated, and I worried if they would get, cancer.
We're looking at cleanup costs that are going to be somewhere between $70 and $100 million to clean up this groundwater basin here?
I worried about everybody in our town that never had their water tested. And I worried that they would never know.
I was amazed to learn that not only by making wise food choices do I improve the quality of my own health, but also I improve the quality of our water. What we eat collectively has an incredible impact on our resources, particularly our water. The more I learned, the more connections I saw, the more I began to imagine what could happen if we ate a little less meat.
Okay, how many of you here like mathematics? Yes. As I became aware of the threat that our animal-based diet posed not only to our health, but to our environment, I began to study more, and I was often asked to address groups, including schools. Okay, I want you to imagine that you are marooned all by yourself on a desert island. It's just you, and you are responsible for growing your own food. So with a lot of hard work and plowing and working in the fields, you are able to produce for yourself 12 pounds of grain. Okay, now I just happen to have for you here 12 pounds of grain. If it was 12 pounds of corn, what could you make out of it? Rebecca?
Cornflakes.
Out of 12 pounds of corn, you could make 54 bowls of cornflakes. And what if the grain you were growing was wheat? What can you make out of wheat?
Bread.
Bread. Out of 12 pounds of wheat, you could make about 12 loaves of bread. That would last you almost 2 weeks. Now, suppose instead of eating these grains in the form of spaghetti or cereals or bread, you want to add to your diet meat. Now, how are you going to convert your grain into meat? Well, I just happen to have a super handy-dandy deluxe grain converter that will turn grain into meat. Stacey, will you help me? I want you to take your grain and I want you to put it into my handy-dandy grain converter and turn it into meat. Okay, so we've put our 12 pounds of hard-earned grain into our super-duper handy-dandy grain converter here, and we're going to do a little magic here. So I want everybody to close your eyes while I turn the crank. I don't want anybody disturbing the energy field here. And we'll do our little magic grain conversion into meat. Now, open your eyes. Now, we put 12 pounds of grain in here. How many pounds of ground beef do you think that we can get out of here? Yes?
12 pounds.
12 pounds. Yes?
10 pounds.
10 pounds. Stacy, why don't you show everybody how much ground beef we got for our 12 pounds of hard-earned grain? 1 pound of ground beef. 12 pounds of grain will create a lot of breads and pastas and cereals and spaghetti. But if you take your 12 pounds of grain and put it into my magic box, it will only give you 1 pound of ground beef. That's what happens when we feed our grains to cows. We put in 12 pounds of grain into the cow, and we receive only 1 pound of beef back. Now let's go back to our imaginary desert island. If you were growing grains to feed yourself, you'd have to farm about 1/6 of an acre. But if you were growing grains to feed to a cow in order to eat beef, you're going to have to farm 12 times that much land. And farming all that extra land in America is changing the face of our country. When the first settlers arrived in North America, the great majority of our continent was covered with luxurious, life-giving forests and tall prairie grasses. The air was clear, the water was pure, and wildlife abounded everywhere. Today, when you fly over most of our country, you see most of our forests and prairies are gone. And they've been cleared not for asphalt and cities, but for grazing and cropland. Now you might say, well, we have to grow food to eat, but the reality is that most of the grain that we grow in this country is not eaten by people, we feed it to animals. 80% of the corn eaten in America is eaten by animals. And 90% of the soybean crops, 90% of the oats are fed to animals.
If we grow vast extra amounts of grain to feed cattle, what effect does that have on the environment? Highly toxic pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides are standard in farming today, along with nitrate fertilizers. I asked farmers and people in agribusiness, why do we use so many chemicals?
Chemicals and mainly fertilizer and pesticides have come into dominance in the last 50 years and have helped to increase the crop yields in this country tremendously. The flip side is that they've often been overused and misused, and this has caused severe environmental problems in places where we have agriculture.
Well, farmers have sort of gotten into a way of farming that's been promoted in the last 30 years or so. Fertilizers were cheap then, and they were promoted by the university researchers as the most efficient way to produce food.
Well, I think it's not that the farmer particularly wants to do the wrong thing. These guys don't stay up all night trying to figure out how to pollute the environment. But they were taught a certain type of agricultural practice that they used, and now we're finding that some of that was wrong.
Chemicals from agriculture often find their way into our lakes and waterways. Nitrates from fertilizer and manure can cause the algae to grow out of all proportion, smothering the other forms of life by using up precious oxygen. The result can be a disaster for every form of life that depends upon this ecosystem.
Corn is one of those major grains that is utilized in livestock production, and this is where the largest amount of insecticide, the largest amount of herbicides, and the largest amount of fertilizers are used in the nation.
In rural America, half of all the water wells are now contaminated by nitrates and other chemicals from agriculture, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. If a pregnant woman drinks this water, some researchers believe her fetus will be at higher risk for birth defects. The more I learned and the more connections that I saw, the more a vision began to take hold in me. I began to see what a diet for a new America would bring to us. We'd have cleaner water. We'd have less toxic chemicals building up in the food chains, less agrochemicals in the food that we eat. We'd have healthier bodies. We'd have a healthier world. What I didn't know was that there was still another example of how things are connected. Another lesson I was about to learn. Some of the animals raised for beef are in the western half of the country, where the climate is often dry. Some of the grains and pasture crops they're fed are also grown in the west, in regions where rainfall is scarce and water is a precious resource. When I drive through parts of the west, I sometimes wonder how any crop can grow here. The answer is they don't, unless you find some way to bring them water. Irrigating crops in such dry places requires enormous amounts of water. Few city people are aware of how much water is used to irrigate cattle feed. If you've seen California, you'd guess that most of the state's water is used in Los Angeles. 12 million people surrounded by lawns and swimming pools, irrigating a semi-desert. But irrigating pasture crops and alfalfa uses more water than all the people in Los Angeles combined. In fact, more than all the cities in the state taken together.
It is estimated that so much water is used to irrigate all the croplands and pasture lands to provide feed for the animals that every 1,000-pound steer carcass that comes down the assembly line at the slaughterhouse has consumed enough fresh water to float a naval destroyer.
We're subsidizing livestock by giving them cheap water. In a sense, we're actually paying the livestock industry with our own resources. We're depleting what is incredibly valuable to cities, to people who need it for drinking water, to wildlife, to the whole life support systems of the West and of the United States in general. in order to be able to give livestock an inordinate share, vastly more than any other industry takes.
To grow a pound of apples in California today, you need 49 gallons of water. A pound of potatoes uses 24 gallons, according to the University of California. But a pound of beef produced in California today uses more than 5,000 gallons of water.
Half the water used in the United States today and consumed is consumed in order to raise crops so that they can be fed to livestock. As a consequence, what's happened is that particularly in the southwestern part of the United States, or in the high plain states, where the Ogallala Reservoir, which is an underground aquifer, is being pumped up and is being used to such an extraordinary extent that some say within this generation it will be exhausted. An area that had as much water in it as the Great Lakes. If that water goes to feed livestock, we're going to see an undermining of the entire economies of the high plain states.
Buried deep beneath the Great Plains, under the very heart of our continent, lies the world's largest store of fresh water. A gift from the Ice Ages, this natural wonder was formed over geological time. The people and the economies of the high plains states depend on it almost exclusively for their water. But this water is now being pumped out so rapidly, environmentalists say that the Ogallala could be bone dry in as few as 30 years. And where's the water going? The great majority is used to irrigate crops, to feed cattle.
Especially since the drought of 1988, it's very clear how precious water is, and our rivers and aquifers are running at very low levels, and large-scale animal agriculture draws more water out of our rivers and aquifers than any other activity we engage in as a society.
So if we're concerned with water, and it is the lifeblood not only of the West, but of this whole country, then we're going to have to begin to eat less meat and begin to put the water on only those crops that we're going to consume ourselves.
When people buy meat, they think the price they pay is so many dollars and cents. But if we could look at that meat and see the true cost it embodies, enormous quantities of water, vast areas of land, the contamination of our life support systems, the cost to the environment must now be counted as part of the true price that we pay for any product.
If Americans change their diet and decrease the amount of meat they're eating, there's going to be a tremendous amount of land freed up with which we could do wonderful things.
Just try to imagine what could happen if people were to eat less meat in this country. It would relieve the pressure to grow more crops to feed to the livestock. And as a consequence, those croplands could be reforested to the tunes of tens of millions of acres, which could help even the global warming situation.
With a healthy forest, we have a continuing supply of lumber to build our houses. A healthy forest takes oxygen and places it into the air, takes carbon dioxide out of the air. It stabilizes the topsoil, it purifies the water, it provides a home for wildlife to bring in the tourists. A healthy forest is worth far more than an acre of grass with a cow on it. Just letting the forest come back would be a wonderful use for these lands.
We'd be able to find that water was available where it wasn't before, because all of it wouldn't have to go to trying to create crops to feed the livestock. So we'd have a greater amount of water for cities to grow.
It would also mean that the amount of chemicals that we are pouring into the environment would be drastically reduced. And every bit that we can do to reduce chemicals going into our environment is very, very critical at this point.
We would have less heart attacks. We would have less strokes. We would have less cancers and less fear of cancer. We would have less diabetes. We'd be trimmer, more fit, more healthy, more happy people.
And I think if we really, as human beings, ask those questions of what is the impact of my meat consumption, how are the animals treated which end up on my table, then we have a choice to make, to respect life, and maybe to eat less meat.
So we have choices to make. We have healing choices to make. Choices that can heal us, heal our self-respect, heal our bodies. As we cease or diminish the amount of animal fat we're running through our bloodstream, we feel better almost immediately. Our life insurance companies and doctors will be pleased. The animals, though they haven't a voice to tell us, will be profoundly pleased. The rivers, our children, our grandchildren, all those yet to be born, perhaps are those most pleased. Well, Norman Cousins put it, I think, most beautifully. He said, "Nothing is more powerful than an individual acting out of his or her conscience, own conscience, thus helping to bring the collective conscience to life." But it isn't what you say that matters, it's how you live. It is the integrity of your own being. It is the alignment of your own spirit.
As we go through the 90s, I absolutely am certain that the environmental coalitions are going to begin to arise and join with the health communities and those concerned with hunger and those concerned with animal protection, and join together in a new great coalition that will say to the American people that if you care about these things, eat less meat.
I think what we're learning as a culture today is incredibly important. We're learning that nature is not a commodity. It's not something that you can extract whatever you want from and not even try to understand the consequences. Instead, what nature is it's a community of which we are a part and to which we owe our lives. When we cherish nature, we cherish ourselves. When we really appreciate and take care of the natural world, our lives have a meaning that's greater than ourselves and at the same time essential to ourselves. There's a beauty that's beginning to dawn in our times, and I think it's wonderful to be part of it.